Flannery O'Connor is a very interesting author. She has a unique voice. She does have a women's writer voice. She also has a Southern writer's voice. But I mean, aside from any of these pigeonhole compartment titles you could think of, she writes some really good stories. She also wrote a couple of novels. She doesn't have a huge body of literature, and that's unfortunately because she died at a relatively early age. I do recommend checking out some biographical information about Flannery O'Connor. She's a very interesting woman. Someone I really wish I could have met. She would have been someone very interesting to talk with. She seemed to have a very good sense of humor. She seemed to have a brilliant insight on the world and how it works, and also something very important to Flannery O'Connor was religion, was spirituality. She attended mass every day, and we definitely see the importance of religion in her work, and we also see an importance of religion as far as we see not only characters who have religion, but we also see a lot of characters that Flannery O'Connor creates who are seeking some kind of spiritual nourishment, as we have actually with arguably a couple of different characters we have in the story A Good Man is Hard to Find. I think it's easy to argue that the misfit is seeking spiritual nourishment, but also I think we could argue that the grandmother is someone who would view herself as full, but in reality her stomach is empty from actual spiritual nourishment. So, anyway, just to set a little context, if you're in my class, what I'll do is I'll post a video, a biographical video about Flannery O'Connor. If you're listening to this for another class, or if you're just listening to this because you came across it, I do recommend just searching a little bit about Flannery O'Connor's background. I don't think it would be a waste of your time, and you'll probably find out you like her as well. So let's talk about the story. A Good Man is Hard to Find. It's a neat story. And there's a lot of things that make it neat that, of course, I'll go over. But I have to say that one of the things I love most about the story is the characters that we have. Specifically, we got to talk about the grandmother because she's an interesting character. We're talking about this story in our unit on duality. And I think the grandmother helps us understand this because she's dual natured. She definitely is someone who sees herself as a certain way, but that's actually pretty different than I bet we see her. So let's talk about how the grandmother views herself. She definitely sees herself as a proper lady, and we have evidence of that by the text support here, where the narrator says, in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. And this is referring to the outfit that she selects. It's almost like a costume that she's picking, an important costume, or a uniform, really, the uniform of a good Southern woman, or not even woman, but a good Southern lady with a capital L. So um, we also have several points in the story where we see the grandmother views herself as separate from those around her, and separate. I think that separation is going to be where she sees herself as elevated from those around her. This kind of she kind of turns up her nose, and we have, for example, a quote that we'll examine further later on, but a quote where she talks about her generation being the better generation than June Star's generation. And by all evidence of June Star's actions and her brother's actions, I mean, they're terrible kids, so the way they behave kind of does validate what the grandmother says about her generation being better and more respectful than theirs. But I don't think the two kids are representative of an entire generation. Plus, we have the grandmother herself behave in kind of deplorable ways, and also exhibit pretty despicable traits such as racism that seem to be products of the generation she came from. So we'll definitely talk about that. But she does view herself as separate from those around her, and that separation is one of elevation on her part. Now, this will come back to towards the end of this video because at the end of the story, we have an important insight that the grandmother has. It's arguably an epiphany where her head clears and she has a sudden life changing insight. And that insight maybe instead of seeing herself as elevated from those around her, she starts to see herself equal to. She makes connections with people that before she would never connect herself with. But we will explore that later on. Let's talk about how we view her. It's probably different than how the grandmother views herself. I'll say this: the grandmother is a character that seems to be a little bit more sympathetic for Southern audiences. And this is actually something Flannery O'Connor noticed in her lectures and pointed out that the Northern audiences tend to give the grandmother's character a harder time. They have less patience or less sympathy for how she is than Southern audiences. And I find some of my classes on the discussion board, students will mention that the grandmother behaves in ways that remind them of how their own, uh, really, grandmothers behave. And I think that's a fair connection to make. Flannery O'Connor was a Southerner. She was born and lived her entire life in the South. The South was very important to her. She studied it. She studied the good and the bad of it, and she didn't shy away from the sin that was deeply entwined in the South. In fact, a lot of writers and academics may have tried to shy away from the sinful past of the South. She sought to kind of shine a light on it. And we see this in the story that we'll definitely talk about as far as the misfit and the grandmother being representative of some of that sin of the South. But the South is very important for Flannery O'Connor, and it's an important setting in this story. Um, but it also helps us kind of uh, if we are an audience member who's from the South, we tend to have a better time connecting with the grandmother than some other geographically located audiences. And I just think that's interesting that your location of where you were born and raised kind of can impact how you interpret a story. But according to Flannery O'Connor and also students and academics, that is the case. So let's talk about the grandmother. I don't think she's necessarily heroic, but she's not without her charm. For example, towards the beginning of the story, I like how she makes a point of disagreeing with the plans of the trip, that she doesn't want the trip to go the way that the rest of the family want it to go. So she makes a point of complaining. And yet the next morning, when it's time to go on the trip, and she's made it clear that she doesn't want the trip to happen the way it's going to happen, notice it says the next morning the grandmother was the first one in the car ready to go. And this to me I love because I know people like this. This is where Flannery O'Connor has seen maybe not just Southern people, but people in general, human nature and how people behave. We probably know someone who loves to complain, uh, yet also loves to participate in what they've complained against. That they're the first one on board when it's time for a plan that they before have actively undermined. But another line we have, this is one we've mentioned, but it's an important line. It actually adds several dimensions for this story. It adds dimensions as far as how the grandmother sees herself and her generation as elite, as above the current and following generations, but also the irony of that not being true. This also brings up the idea of race, which is an important idea in this story. It's an important theme in a lot of Flannery O'Connor's work. But I like here that she handles race kind of backhandedly on the grandmother's part, because we have here the grandmother saying, "In my time," said the grandmother, folding her thin veined fingers, "children were more respectful of their native states and their parents and everything else. People did right then." And in the same breath as she's just spent talking about how good her generation was, she says, "Oh, look at the cute little pickaninny." And this is a derogatory term. This is a racist term to use. It's not the worst one that we have in the story, but it is one that she uses without pause. She also uses several other derogatory racial terms in the story, and she doesn't give it a thought. And I think that it's important to understand that Flannery O'Connor is doing this on purpose. Um, Mark Twain did a similar tactic as far as Mark Twain being an author of the South who looked around him at what was going on in the South, and instead of approving of it, he chose to handle it with sarcasm. And I think that sarcasm is definitely here. We have the author here criticizing the grandmother because of just the contradiction in this statement, the contradiction about how good she says her generation is, followed immediately in the same breath with this intrinsic racism that it seems the grandmother's generation has just instilled within her, or if not instilled it, at least nourished it. So I think that's important to look at, not only just helping us get to see how the grandmother really is, that she wears a mask, but we kind of glimpse what's behind that mask of the proper lady. The grandmother seems to just see the mask that she wears, this mask being, here I am a proper lady, I'm a Southern lady, but we do get glimpses of what she really is. And that's important for the end of the story, which we'll get to. Also, notice how good she is at manipulating, talking about masks. She's able to appear one way, yet pull strings in another way to get what she wants. And she's actually pretty good at it. Her manipulations work. We see a manipulation begin at the beginning of the story, where she's talking about she would not take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer my conscience if I did. Now, she says this with no clear fear of running into the misfit. I don't think when she said this she thought it would be a remote possibility of running into the misfits. She just didn't want to go to Florida with the rest of the family. She had her own travel plans, and she uses basically uh, parental guilt, which is very effective. And parents out there will sympathize that people are good at targeting it. She uses parental guilt to try to get what she wants. And I think the irony is she ends up being right. I mean, they actually do run into the misfit. But the irony is she had no intention of actually doing that. This was just an empty statement to try to guilt Bailey and crew into doing what she wanted. Also, notice that when they're traveling and she decides she gets confused and thinks that they're somewhere else than they really are, and she decides she wants to find that old house. She knows that Bailey won't go for that plan, so she does a very an ingenious move of instead of trying to make the argument herself, she goes to the more persuasive figure in the car, and that's going to be the kids. She convinces the kids to kind of pester Bailey in order to take the detour because she knows that Bailey wouldn't go for it if she suggests it. This is something that advertisers do for toy commercials. I mean, toy commercials could market their product to parents, saying, "Hey, children, or hey, parents, you should buy this for your children because." But that's not what they do. Most often, it's easy to say, "Hey, kids, you need this," and then the kids, of course, pester the parents into making that happen. So the grandmother here seems to know how to manipulate her family. We also have one final that I'll mention point of manipulation when they do crash, and it's completely the grandmother's fault. She literally lets the cat out of the bag when she lets Pitty Sing out of the box accidentally, and Pitty Sing causes the crash. She knows it's her fault. She also knows that they're not on the road that she thought that they were on. So, in order to kind of keep Bailey's wrath off of her. She's not injured, but she kind of feigns that she is. We do have an injury here. The mother's actually very injured. She has broken bones, but the grandmother, just out of this sense of, I don't want Bailey to be mad at me, she feigns kind of this injury. So let's move away from the grandmother. We'll get to her, especially when we talk about the end. Let's talk about the tone of this story because the tone is pretty wild as far as where it starts and where it ends. I think it fits very well with our duality unit because we do have a very humorous, lighthearted at times. I mean, there are parts in this where I think it's easy to chuckle, even out loud, but then, when the Misfit shows up with his crew, it gets dark really fast, and the tone, it more than shifts, it just derails. This is not a good metaphor, but it's what I always think of. I think of the movie um, uh, From Dusk Till Dawn, which was written by Quentin Tarantino and directed by Robert Rodriguez. It's a great movie, and one thing I love about it so much is that it has this similar derailment. From Dusk Till Dawn starts as a completely different movie. It's got a plot line that it's following, characters in a situation that, two-thirds through the movie, you've got a story that's going that, two-thirds into it just derails, and all of a sudden the last part of the movie is Mexican vampires, and it never gets back on track. But I like it. I like that it starts one way, and then all of a sudden, boom, we've got this tonal shift. Steven Spielberg is another director who's really great at tonal manipulation. Take, for example, just Jaws, which is a great movie, but tonally it's all over the place. It's an adventure movie, it's a horror movie, it's got comedy, it's got, all of these emotions to it, but it doesn't really stay on one of these emotions consistently throughout. It does change it up. And so I like this. Some readers are put off by the tonal shift. Most readers enjoy the first part and they kind of fall off when the misfit shows up. Other readers, they find that's when it just starts getting good. So I'm not really sure where you are, but I think it's important to look at the story as a whole and understand that that tone shift is on purpose. There are some academic essays and also some interviews with Flannery O'Connor that kind of shows the point of why it gets so dark and grotesque. Uh, but we'll talk about that basically when we talk about the grandmother's final gesture in the story. Um, let's move on to we've got here some examples of humor in the story, and I do love the scene where this to me is Flannery O'Connor once again knowing what life is like in the South, and understanding that we in the South are sometimes forced to wear a mask of kindness that we don't really want to wear, but it's expected of us. And Red Sammy Butts' wife shows this when she has to deal with that terrible Gene Star who's being a brat. And I love this line, "Ain't she cute?" the woman repeated, stretching her mouth politely. I love that, stretching her mouth politely, because, if you've been in the South, you've probably been forced to do that against your will, because that's the mask expected of you. Let's move on to fate, because let me define fate here. Fate, for the purpose of this story, I think a good definition of fate would be God's will. God's unchangeable will. And why I say that is because religion is and spirituality are both pillar concepts for Flannery O'Connor. So I think it's important that we be aware of that looking at her stories, because we definitely see the presence of a divine fate in this story. So let's talk about the amount of foreshadowing. There's so much foreshadowing in this story, even though it's lighthearted and it's pretty tame at the story's beginning and even middle. We do have evidence throughout the story that bad things are coming, that the storm of the misfit and his gang that storm is coming and it will hit. For example, early in the story, it talks about the family passing a cemetery, and the cemetery has 5 or 6 graves in it. Well, how many people are in the car? Depending on how you count it, if you count the baby or not, it's between 5 and 6. I think that's on purpose. That's foreshadowing the death. I want to come back to this when the pantsless boy. Let's move on when the misfit shows up. It says the misfit's car is a big black battered hearse-like automobile. Well, that's pretty obvious on the foreshadowing for the hearse. And then also the misfit has some body language where he digs his shoe into the ground and makes a little hole, and then he covers it back up. So this is kind of this idea of, the misfit knows he's going to bury these bodies and cover them up even before he does it. Let's back up a little bit, because we already talked about the quote where the grandmother's talking about how much better her generation is, and then she points out, oh, look at the boy, that boy who's on the side of the road in the shack. They comment that he doesn't have pants on. And I think that's an interesting detail. A lot of students look past it, but keep in mind that's a detail that's odd. I don't think it would be just thrown in accidentally. I think it's doing something because later on when we see the misfit, we have a detail about what the misfit's wearing. He has on blue jeans that were too tight for him. So I argue this suggests that the misfit encountered this boy and the boy lives. The boy is seen on the side of the road, alive and well, minus blue jeans, because the misfit just took the blue jeans because that's what he needed. This suggests that the family could have escaped their encounter with the misfit had the grandmother kept her mouth shut. So think about this. Think about how much stuff had to operate hand in hand for the story to go down as it did. Let's say that at Red Sammy Butts, the grandmother had just stopped to use the restroom before leaving. That would have completely invalidated the course of action later on. There's so many pieces in this that could have operated a little differently than they ended up, and it would have completely changed the outcome. But this story shows that each piece operated together to ultimately bring about this reckoning with the grandmother and the misfit. And it seems odd for me to call it a reckoning, but I really think that's what it is. We have here the force of the grandmother, which starts artificial, but we can argue that artificiality changes. Maybe you don't think it does, but we'll talk about that. You've got the force of the grandmother who comes up against the force of the misfit. And we can argue that both teach each other something that's an important lesson. And we'll talk about what those lessons learned could be in just a little bit. Let's talk about the agent of fate, or, if you talk about agent of fate, this would be someone who is a pawn of God, someone who is doing God's will. Because we actually have two possible agents of fate here. We have one agent we'll talk about in just a little bit will be the grandmother being an agent of God's will for what her encounter with the misfit leaves imprinted on the misfit and how it may change him. But also, we've got to look at an uncomfortable symbolism to create here. It's uncomfortable for a lot of audiences to say this mass murderer, this despicable man, the misfit, may be an agent of God. He may be doing God's will, but one thing we've talked about in the class before is the idea of the Reaper, or death with a capital D. And I wonder if we have a Reaper here, if we have just this inescapable fate that, he even says in the line, nobody gave the Undertaker a tip. That to me just rings very, very hard of him being possibly this inescapable death, or the let's say the ferryman for grandmother's life, the artificial life that she's living into a more realistic, a more genuine spiritual future of what is next. That he may be the ferryman to get her from one side to the next. Um, Let's move into the misfit, okay? Because if you think we've been uncomfortable so far, just buckle up because here we go. Notice the misfit, he's an interesting character because he's also dual. We see him when he shows up, he's very, very calm. I mean, it's almost humorous how flat and calm and cool and well mannered that the misfit is. He's a murderer, but he's also a murderer with manners. Now, this demeanor changes though, because although he starts polite, he does get emotional. I think it's important to look at that shift. So I like this scene here that shows his politeness as far as here you have a murderer who has a family on the side of the road. No one else other than the family and the crew will ever know what's going down here. And notice he still feels this need to be polite, to wear this mask of civility. And this is when the grandmother says, "Why, it's you. You're in the misfit. I knew it as soon as I saw you. I knew it." He says, "Yes'm," the man said, smiling slightly, as if he were pleased in spite of himself to be known, "but it would have been better for all of you, lady, if you hadn't a recognized me." Bailey turned his head sharply and said something to his mother that shocked even the children. The old lady began to cry, and the misfit reddened. So here the misfit is embarrassed by what Bailey says, and the misfit says, "Lady, don't you get upset. Sometimes a man says things he don't mean. I don't reckon he meant to talk to you that way." So here, moments before the misfit's going to put 3 bullets in her chest, he's here trying to console her about what Bailey Boy has said to her. I find that really, I find it funny, but also just there's something there that's worth looking at because we see the misfit changes this demeanor, and it's when he and the grandmother start talking about Jesus, because Jesus is a switch for the misfit that begins to wind him up to a very agitated emotional state. Notice he says, Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead, the misfit continued, and he shouldn't have done it. He's shown everything off balance. If he did what he said he did, it's nothing for you to do but throw down everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then there's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can by killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. I'll pause here. Notice what the definition of the Misfits' idea of a good time is. It's a very that's I hope that doesn't match anyone else's definition of fun, but for the Misfit, this is a good time. To resume, he says, "There's no pleasure but meanness," he said, and his voice had become almost a snarl. Notice in the way his voice is even described, it's no longer that flat drawl we had before. The grandmother says, "Maybe he didn't raise the dead," the old lady mumbled, not knowing what she was saying and feeling so dizzy that she sank down in the ditch with her legs twisted under her. Now, we'll come back to this scene, but the grandmother here seems to be renouncing her faith. I mean, it seems for Christian ideology, the works of Jesus Christ are a pretty important pillar, the miracles that he wrought. So here we have the grandmother who begins to question those when pushed by the misfit. Now we'll come back to that, but notice it says that she's cloudy here mentally. She's dizzy. She's not knowing what she's saying, and we will see a point where her head clears. And when her head clears, she says something different. We'll come to in a moment. The misfit continues in his agitated state. "I wasn't there, so I can't say he didn't," the misfit said. "I wish I'd have been there," he said, hitting the ground with his fist. "It ain't right I wasn't there, because if I'd have been there, I would have known. Listen, lady," he said in a high voice, "if I had been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now." His voice seemed about to crack. What the misfit is having here is basically a crisis of faith. Um, he wants to believe something that he hasn't seen, and he can't do it. He wants to because he thinks he would be a different person and a better person, but that's not enough to convince him. It's not enough for capital T truth for the misfit. He can't trust faith because he hasn't experienced Jesus's miracles for himself. And so I don't really care your religious background. I think this is something that we in life want to trust something that seems either to be something we've not seen, or it may even be we want to trust something that we have seen over and over again. It seems we've seen contrary to what we want to believe. Christianity aside, I think a crisis of faith is something that we would all encounter at some point. Um, and it's important to see what the grandmother does in response to this crisis of faith that the misfit expresses. And we'll get there in just a moment. Before we get to the final moment of the grandmother, let's talk about another possible symbolic presence in this story, and it's an uncomfortable one. When you have the misfit, and he is flanked by 2 criminals. And also, he's been accused of a crime against his father. A lot of readers are able to make a connection between the misfit being symbolic of Jesus, and I think that's valid because I mean I've heard it argued, and Christ on Calvary was flanked by 2 criminals, and he was able to draw equal sign with himself and those criminals, saying, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." We see a similar, I'll stop preaching, but we see a similar connection shown by the grandmother at the story's end. The grandmother who, before her encounter with the misfit, would have never drawn an equal sign between herself and someone like the misfit because she is a good, proper Southern lady, capital L. But this changes. It changes because of her encounter with the misfit. She has an epiphany, and she's able to make a connection with what she once saw herself as completely disconnected with. That changes. We'll talk about that. Um, that's an uncomfortable symbolic connection for a lot of readers to make, especially when you consider that our author here was deeply, uh, you know, not just spiritual but religious. I mean, she really valued religious order in her life, and structure. But I think that symbol is there, so what do you do with it? But look at it. But maybe you can play with it on the discussion board. Tell me what you think about symbolism of the misfit. We talked about him being a reaper. We've talked about the weird one of him being possibly a Christ likened. But we'll talk about another one where he may not be Christ, but he's a prophet. He's someone who's kind of like Jonah. Jonah's trying to escape God's will. God has a plan for Jonah. Jonah thinks he can fight it. Jonah thinks he can change it, but he's ultimately not able to. And we have some lecture material from Flannery O'Connor that helps us argue that the misfit may be in a similar situation of this prophet who has been charged to be a prophet, but he's not yet willing to admit to himself that he doesn't want the job. He's trying to get out of the job of being a prophet that God has laid upon him. And so we'll talk about that in just a moment. So let's talk about this final moment, because for the first two or three times I read this story, I walked away with the story after reading the end, and I saw this as a story about a woman who defined herself as a Christian throughout her life, but she really wasn't good at being Christian when the time came down to it and when she was pressed. And I saw this as basically a story about a woman who wore a mask of Christianity her whole life. And this story shows ultimately she throws down this mask of Christianity, and we see her for what she really is, just, an inadequate woman, no better than any of the rest of us. Now, the cool thing about Flannery O'Connor, she once said that we're free to interpret her stories in more than one way, but she only had one thing in mind, one meaning in mind when she wrote these stories. And I like that because it gives us some freedom to play around with what we read from her, but we still have to prove it, of course. We have to validate our interpretations, but it also lets us know that she has something in mind when she's writing this. She has a plan for what she wants to do with the story, and also she's nice enough to, in several publications, talk about what her plan is. So when I read some of the material that Flannery O'Connor had written about the story "A Good Man is Hard to Find" and the grandmother and the misfits encounter, I had to kind of change my interpretation a bit. I saw another piece of evidence for the grandmother throwing down her mask of Christianity when we have this scene. She wanted to tell him that he must pray. She opened and closed her mouth several times before anything came out. Finally, she found herself saying, "Jesus, Jesus," meaning Jesus will help you. But the way she was saying it, it sounded as if she might be cursing. This to me was like, oh wow, this is evidence here that even the name Jesus now rings false, and it sounds like a curse because she doesn't really have the heart behind it when she says it. But Flannery O'Connor is going to give us some insight in how we can see this you can see the story however you want to, but I see it differently based on what I read from Flannery O'Connor. This became, for me, a story about a woman who wore a mask that didn't matter, a mask of her identity that was precious to her for everyone to see, this mask that she constructed, but it didn't matter. It was phony. And she's able to, by stories in, realize the phoniness of this mask that she has valued for her entire life. And she's able to take this mask off and throw it down. And that is when she's able to see that she is connected with the misfit, that she's not separate from him, but they are bound together in an unbreakable bond that um, it's a terrible moment, but it's also a beautiful moment. It's terrible for the misfit because look at how he reacts. He recoils like a snake, and that's on purpose. And he fires three times. And from any of my videos that number three, you gotta be aware of the Trinity when we hear that three, especially with Flannery O'Connor. So here's the quote that Flannery O'Connor gives us. She's here trying to defend her work a little bit because a lot of critics found the violence of Flannery O'Connor to be a bit too much. It's interesting that the second time I'm bringing up Quentin Tarantino, but a similar criticism on Tarantino's work. Great though it is, a lot of people say it's just too graphic, it's too violent, and it's violent for the sake of violence, it's not doing anything. I disagree with that, and so does Tarantino. But um, I think it's interesting. The same criticism was made of Flannery O'Connor's work, and she defends it by saying that the violence in the story has a purpose, that the aspect of the grotesque, it has a job, and that job is to wake someone up from a life of slumbering. uh, and in our realities, think about how many times you go through your life, and you just wake up one day and kind of look around and you realize that you've been on autopilot for who knows how many months. And she says that violence can be something that's terrible, but it can also be an agent of positivity and change by waking us up, by making us aware, very, very aware of what's going on around us, and what's going on within us, and forcing us into a moment of revelation. And so, from that, we have this quote. I often ask myself what makes a story work and what makes it hold up as a story. And I've decided it's probably some action, some gesture of a character that is unlike any other in the story, one which indicates where the real heart of the story lies. This would have to be an action or a gesture which is both totally right and totally unexpected. It would have to be one that both in character and beyond character. It would have to suggest both the world and eternity. The action or gesture I'm talking about would have to be on an anagological level, that is, the level which has to do with the divine life and our participation in it. It would be a gesture that transcended any neat allegory that might have been intended or any pat moral categories a reader could make. It would be a gesture which somehow made contact with mystery. I like here, just to pause, that Flannery O'Connor seems aware of what we're trying to do right now and making this make sense. And she says that for a story to work, it has to avoid making sense. It has to touch this mystery. There is a point in the story where such a gesture occurs. The grandmother is at last alone, facing the misfit. Her head clears for an instant, and she realizes, even in her limited way, she's responsible for the man before her, and joined to him by ties of kinship, which have their roots deep in the mystery she's been merely prattling about so far. And at this point, she does the right thing. She makes the right gesture. And this is interesting because the right thing to do, the gesture she makes, that here our author says is right, what's it get her? It gets her shot. It gets her killed. But if you look at how the grandmother looks after she dies, it says she looks, her body has kind of sunk into where her head is looking up and smiling at the heavens. And it's definitely a peaceful last image that we have of the grandmother. And so, what's the effect of this? Since she makes the right gesture, why is it the right gesture? What's it do? Because the story just ends. I mean, the story just cuts off. She's killed. The misfit and his cohorts go on about their way. The grandmother says basically that this the action that the grandmother does would have an effect on the misfit, but that was a story that she never got around to writing. She says, I don't want to equate the misfit with the devil. I prefer to think that, however unlikely this may seem, the old lady's gesture, like the mustard seed, will grow to be a great crow-filled tree in the misfit's heart, and will become enough of a pain to him there to turn him into the prophet he was meant to become. So, I know that this is a preachy story, which, I think it works on that level very well, but also I think this works very well with the point of higher education. I think one of the best results of higher education is understanding that you are connected with things that you had no idea that you were connected with, that you are tied with forces that you've had no idea about before, and you catch a glimpse of it and you still don't understand it, but you just know enough to know that you're a part of it. And it can be a terrible revelation, but it's also vital revelation to getting things changed, to getting um, understanding that chaos is the mask and that there is order underneath the mask of chaos. That at times it's easier for us to just glimpse this mask of chaos and saying, well, we'll never understand it because there is no order. It's easier for us to say that than understand that there is an order there. We just may not be able to grasp it. And I think that that's the ultimate point that we have in this story, that the grandmother serves her role here in the right way, but the role she has is a role that has consequence far outlasting her death. It's, the grandmother is able to be that snowflake that will ultimately roll into a snowball that can be an agent of change for the misfit. So, hey, I look forward to seeing your insights on the discussion board. Feel free to expand on what I've said or add your own thoughts. It's a fun story, but it's also a dark story. There's a lot going on here, and I look forward to seeing your thoughts on it. So, thank you very much for your attention on this. Bye bye.